The SPY now turns to the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good afternoon, fellows. I want to start the week by talking about President Trump's commutation of Roger Stone late Friday night. Given the president's persistent hints that he was going to use his pardoning powers to prevent Stone from going to jail, the actual announcement might be seen as anticlimactic. Nonetheless, it might have been Donald Trump's most audacious use of executive powers to protect an associate to date. Al, what, if any, is the political fallout of letting Roger Stone off the hook?
The president letting Roger Stone off the hook was wrong. It was an egregious abuse of executive power, but it's entirely predictable, and it won't have very much fallout on this election. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We've got a depression. We have racial unrest in the country. So I suspect voters will have plenty to think about other than Roger Stone when they go to the polls. But the thing that strikes me is that over the last few days, we've really seen the president exhibit his three-pronged re-election strategy. First, it's to do anything necessary to conceal his really criminal behavior in a sense, and that's what the Roger Stone combination was about. Second, he seems to play to the worst instincts of his base, and he did his best George Wallace imitation on the Confederate Party on an interview on CBS News to sort of scratch that itch. And third, he seems to be intent on trying to depress the vote, and that was what his constant screeds about mail-in voting seemed to be about. And incidentally, on that front, I'm very positive and supportive of Larry Hogan on the way he's handled the virus. But boy, I think he's made a mistake when he's decided not to use mail-in ballots in this election. The problem for the president is that his strategy isn't working. His poll numbers keep going down. His base keeps shrinking, and I don't think commuting Roger Stone's sentence is going to change any of that.
Craig?
Well, I'm pretty much where Al is on this one. I don't understand it, except that it's, I guess, consistent. I mused a little while ago that I thought that this president would probably commute the sentence of Bonnie and Clyde if he could, because he didn't like banks. He just simply abuses the power he has in office. This is an individual who committed crimes, was convicted of that. To give you a little perspective, when I was involved with Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush and his 1988 presidential campaign, Roger Stone was working for Donald Trump and would come through trying to get some of us in the Bush campaign to go up and meet with Donald Trump in New York. Something I did not do and did not understand why we should do, but the two of them have been paired together for a long time, and hopefully after November, they can go off and do some other things together, not involving the government.
I also wanted to talk to you all about the defeat of former Attorney General Jeff Sessions to win back his Senate seat in Alabama to a political newcomer and former football coach Tommy Tuberville. Clearly, President Trump's efforts to defeat his former Attorney General was successful. But how will this impact the November election against the incumbent and very vulnerable Democrat Doug Jones?
Well, in some ways, I suppose it wasn't a surprise. It's a seat that a Republican should win, all things being equal, which of course they're not in this election cycle, but presumably should win. I think, for me, the takeaway from the election was that with a very low voter turnout, the Trump candidate did very well. It says to me that the Trump organization or the Trump supporters are going to come out to vote. I think the vote was something like 10 or 15% of the electorate, which is really pretty small in this election. But Trump supporters come out, and it should be a message to people in the general election that if you want to affect the course of the election, you've got to come out and vote for sure. But I think that was the principal takeaway, other than the fact that, you know, Donald Trump really is kind of bully in chief. I mean, he bludgeoned poor Jeff Sessions week after week after week in this race. It's a little unheard of to get involved in a primary at all, but it's certainly unheard of to get involved and actively oppose your former Attorney General.
Al, what are your thoughts?
Excuse me. From the day that Doug Jones was first elected in the special election, it's been an uphill fight for him for re-election. I don't think this primary will change that at all. I'm sure the president will do plenty of bragging about how he has all this great influence in a low turnout, as Craig said, primary in Alabama. If he didn't have any influence in Alabama, I don't know where he's going to. But if I were a Republican, I'd really be worried about Senate contests around the country there in states like Arizona, in Colorado, Maine, Montana, North Carolina, Iowa, Kansas, 2 seats in Georgia. In each case, a Republican holds those seats and is in some sort of trouble. And I doubt very much whether President Trump is going to be a major factor or be of much help in the general election, because they're going to all be running away from him as fast as they can go.
Finally, a viewer wrote in to ask your thoughts about the newly formed Lincoln Project. What makes this group interesting is that they are made up of either Republicans or former Republicans that are mobilizing against Donald Trump. Many of our viewers don't know what that is, so I want to show a clip of some of the advertising they now have online.
In the last year, flag-draped coffins have returned from Afghanistan. Now we know Vladimir Putin pays a bounty for the murder of American soldiers. Donald Trump knows too, and does nothing. Putin pays the Taliban cash to slaughter our men and women in uniform. And Trump is silent, weak, controlled. Instead of condemnation, he insists Russia be treated as our equal. Instead of retaliation, he invites Putin to America. When Trump tells you he stands by the troops, he's right. Just not our troops. The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Craig, do these campaigns work?
You know, I think the groups like this, in my view, and I'm, you know, maybe a little old-fashioned about it, end up not having the impact that they think they're going to have, because by the time we get to late October, the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign will have spent millions and millions of dollars and gotten even more attention in the national press for, you know, the policies they're running on and the way they're conducting their campaign. Having said that, Al is quite right. These are very able, very talented, very creative people behind this organization, and they may well produce an ad in this current climate that goes viral, and that somehow becomes a message that both campaigns have to address. Probably the best thing that could happen is to have the president addressing them. But absent that, I don't know that they'll have the influence they hope to have. It is a sign that there are many more Republicans and Republicans who've worked for major Republican candidates who were very disenfranchised with the incumbent, and I think that spells trouble for him in its own right.
Al, what do you think of the Lincoln Project?
Well, I think the Lincoln Project's run some pretty effective ads, and I think they're going to have a real impact on the election. you know, they aren't going to go out and they aren't going to convince all the most ardent Trump supporters, but that's not their audience. I think they'll have some impact on swing voters, particularly in the suburbs. College-educated women who are key swing vote in the election, usually vote Republican presidential elections. And in 2016, a lot of them held their noses and voted for Donald Trump. In 2018, a good number of them, most of them, voted for Democrats for Congress, and that's why the Democrats won the House back. I think what the Lincoln Project ads will do will be a constant reminder to those voters as why they don't like Donald Trump. The project is led by a lot of hard-nosed, very good, successful Republican operatives who want to not only defeat Donald Trump, but really banish him. And I think a lot of Republicans are going to want to follow their lead.
Al Fromm and Craig Fuller, thank you. See you next time.